Thank you, Tony. One thing I might correct is you said it's my book. I really consider it my grandfather's book. It's all his writing. I did do a lot of work putting it together. And when I started talking to Tony about getting it published, he said, "That's great. We do have to have a live person to represent the book." So that's kind of my job. Uh, but it is really my grandfather's book. I'm a grandson of Harvey Nininger. He also went by HH. He was a well-known pioneer in the science of meteoritics, which is the study of meteorites. I'm not a meteoriticist, but I'm somewhat knowledgeable on the subject, and I'm very familiar with my grandfather's story. His original autobiography, Find a Falling Star, was published in 1972, and it's out of print, but it's still well known among students of meteorites, and it's in demand on eBay and Amazon and other places. My grandfather lived a very unusual and eventful life, and he wrote a massive autobiography. It was originally about 1,500 pages, so way longer even than this book. He tried for years to get it published and revised it and tried again to get it published, and most people just said it was too long. When he was 85 years old, he decided it was kind of now or never to get it published. So a friend of his who had always been a big supporter of his work helped him find a publisher and helped pay to get it published. That publisher quickly cut the book at least by half, if not more, and rushed it to press. Book is still popular, but there's some problems with it, and it really didn't turn out to be the story that my grandfather wanted to tell. So that's where I came in, and that's how I met Tony, and I'm deeply appreciative for all his assistance helping this project finally make it to press. I reassembled and re-edited many, many copies of original manuscripts. The book still had to be shortened, but I had the time and knowledge of the subject to do it right this time. The book was just released last November, so I'll be speaking a little bit about my grandfather's life and meteorites in general. Got to find the right button. It's not working. There we go. This is my grandfather. As Tony mentioned, he was known as the father of modern meteoritics. He became interested in meteorites in 1923. And we say modern meteoritics because by that time it was accepted that meteorites had come from space. That happened in the early 1800s, but there really wasn't much of a science of meteoritics at that time. In the mid-1920s, there were two men in America who were most involved in meteorites. Dr. George Merrill of the United States National Museum of the Smithsonian Institution, and Dr. Oliver C. Farrington of the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago. However, either these two were reaching the end of their careers, and it seemed like their interest was waning. There were two dealers in minerals and meteorites at that time that purchased and supplied specimens to museums. Meteorites were seen as a curiosity or a sideline to geology or astronomy rather than a science in itself. The meteorites that were known at that time were either stumbled upon and recognized because they looked so different than ordinary rocks. Those were mostly iron meteorites, or they were literally seen to fall out of the sky. For the most part, scientists thought everything that could be learned from meteorites had been learned. No one was actively trying to find meteorites. There were no college courses on meteorites, no institutions studying meteorites, and certainly no one devoting his life to meteorites until my grandfather. Nininger was born in 1887 in Conway Springs, Kansas. He was raised in a fundamentalist community where education wasn't really valued, and science in particular was considered the devil. His school was literally a one-room schoolhouse with 63 students ranging from 6 to 21 years in age. It was more a place to put the kids when they weren't needed in the fields than a place for education. In this photo, Harvey on the right is 19, which is how old he was when he graduated from his local school. He believes he was the first student to ever graduate from that school. Most simply quit. He graduated with the equivalent of an 8th grade education. He then managed to attend the state normal school, which was a combination of high school and the first 2 years of college. He followed that up attending and graduating from McPherson College in Kansas. He taught for a stint at Laverne College in California and earned a master's degree in entomology. He eventually returned to teach at McPherson College, where he was introduced to meteorites in a very dramatic way. In the late summer of 1923, he read an article about meteorites. He said he had never read anything that so completely captivated him. He knew his chances for actually witnessing a meteorite were very small, but still he thought about how one might determine the course and approximate place of landing if he did see one, and how one might obtain assistance from the community for a search. A couple months later, on November 9th, 1923, he was walking home from a college program with a friend, and, quoting from the book, suddenly a blazing stream of fire pierced the sky, lighting the landscape as though nature had pressed a giant electric switch. The blade of light vanished with equal suddenness, leaving a darkness seeming thicker than before. His friend was speechless. Then he turned and saw that Nininger was bent over making a mark on the sidewalk to mark the fireball's direction. He told his friend he was going to find that meteorite. He then went home and sent messages to newspapers in the area, asking them to request information from anyone who had seen the fireball. He requested they provide the location of the observation, the direction of the fireball, the height of the fireball, and whether there had been any sound. Reports came in, but they were a mismatch. Fireballs are difficult to track. They are always a surprise. When a fireball passes over the horizon or behind an object, people assume it has hit the ground. In reality, it's probably still 15 or 20 miles high and is just behind the horizon. Most reports tried to pinpoint where they thought it had landed. He followed up on the reports that seemed the most credible and identified an area about 40 miles across where it might have landed. It wasn't where one of the observers thought, but where the reports converged. He concluded that fragments might have landed in the vicinity of Coldwater, Kansas. He knew the chances were small that he could just go out and find fragments, but he took some students out for a weekend trip anyway. They found nothing. He tried to get to the community involved. He visited schools, persuaded the newspapers to print articles, and offered to pay for specimens. This photo, of course, is not the fireball he witnessed. It's just a nice photo of a meteor, and it's probably much smaller than the one he witnessed. Within a year, there were 2 meteorites recovered from the vicinity of Coldwater. They were from 2 separate falls. One was an iron meteorite, one was a stony meteorite. I'll talk more about those definitions in a minute. The first was found by a minister. Nininger stopped by a church and asked to make a short presentation to the congregation before services. After the service, the minister said he thought he might have a meteorite in his backyard that he plowed up some years before. That was a 41-pound iron meteorite. The second one was found by a farmer who hit a strange stone with his plow. He reported it to the local newspaper editor, who informed my grandfather. That turned out to be an 11-pound stony meteorite. My grandfather eventually attributed neither one of them to the fireball he had witnessed, but the credit went to his efforts to get the community involved. These successes inspired his future efforts in tracking down and finding meteorites. Now I'll talk a bit about meteorites in general and get back to my grandfather in a minute. At its most basic, a meteorite is a rock that falls from space. A meteoroid is that rock as it travels through space. A meteor is the light effect that results from that rock traveling through the atmosphere. A meteorite is what survives and lands on Earth. A fireball is a large meteor, appearing the size of a quarter of a full moon or larger. Most meteorites come from the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter. The asteroids aren't as dense as shown on this diagram, but they are organized in bands as they're shepherded by Jupiter. Every once in a while, they bump into each other, and pieces can get knocked into Earth-crossing orbits. There are 3 main types of meteorites. Stony meteorites. These are made mostly of silicate minerals. Iron meteorites. These are almost completely made of metal, mainly nickel iron. And stony iron meteorites. These have nearly equal amounts of metal and silicate minerals. Each group can be split into many more classes and types, depending on the minerals, structure, and chemistry. There are 2 main types of stony meteorites, chondrites and achondrites. Chondrites have little round grains called chondrules. You can see them in this photo. They are thought to be over 4.5 billion years old, and the chondrules are thought to be the first things that condensed in the solar system. Achondrites don't have chondrules. They're igneous, meaning at some point they were melted. Achondrites include meteorites from asteroids, as well as meteorites from the moon and Mars. Lunar and Martian meteorites were blasted off their parent bodies by a meteorite impact and thrown into orbit and eventually fell on the Earth. Most iron meteorites are thought to be from the cores of asteroids that melted early in their history. They consist mainly of nickel iron metal with small amounts of sulfide and carbide minerals. This is a slice of a Canyon Diablo meteorite, the meteorite that created the famous crater in Arizona. This has been cut and etched with acid to reveal its crystal structure. This is known as a Widmanstätten pattern. It's a very distinctive pattern that can be used to identify different iron meteorites. The bands are formed by varying levels of nickel. Iron meteorites crystallize very slowly from a molten state. It's thought to be a rate of about 1 degree per million years. This is a stony iron meteorite, a palisite. Stony iron meteorites consist of almost equal parts of iron, nickel, metal, and silicon minerals. Palisites are stony iron meteorites which contain crystals of olivine embedded in metal. They are really the showstoppers when it comes to meteorites. It is thought that they have come from the boundary between the mantle and core of an asteroid. This is a mesosiderite. Mesositerites are breccias, a type of rock composed of fragments of minerals or rocks cemented together by a finer material. Mesositerites are thought to form from a collision between two asteroids. Meteorites are named after the closest town or post office to where they are found. This one is called the Estherville meteorite because it's found right close to you near Estherville, Iowa. The Estherville meteorite fell on May 10th, 1879. There was a shower of thousands of stones. 3 large fragments, 431, 152, and 101 pounds, and hundreds of smaller pieces were recovered. There's a monument along Highway 4 north of Estherville where one of the larger meteorites landed. And there's a piece of the meteorite at the Estherville Meteorite Center. And I know the Estherville Chamber of Commerce has more information. Most of the information about meteorites we just went over wasn't known in 1923 when my grandfather witnessed the fireball that put him on his path. After he had seen that fireball and recovered 2 meteorites in the vicinity of Coldwater, he became engrossed in meteorites and tried to learn as much about them as he could in his spare time. He found that there was not a lot of information available and soon became somewhat of an expert by default, simply by reading whatever material he could lay his hands on and making some field investigations. So he decided, since geologists and astronomers weren't paying much attention to meteorites, that a biologist might as well start working on the subject as anyone. He knew his program would have to be self-supporting. The president of McPherson College was supportive and allowed him to carry a reduced teaching load. He had his experience as a natural history lecturer and thought he could help fund his program by lecturing. The lecture fees didn't do much more than pay travel expenses, but he hoped by arousing interest in the subject that new meteorites would be discovered. So he set out on a program to recover and study meteorites by lecturing about them, finding them, and trading and selling them. The first meteorite recovery directly traceable to his education program was the Covert, Kansas meteorite. The first find was picked up in October 1929 by a young man that had heard a school lecture by my grandfather 4 years earlier. That find was about the size of a potato. Within a few months, a half dozen meteorites with a combined weight of 140 pounds had been recovered. All had been lying around for years and were only reported after it became known that a boy had received money for his rock. One of these had been used for a doorstop, one held down a pickle jar lid, and a 31-pounder had been used to plug a rat hole. The Covert meteorite gave him the confidence that his program would succeed. He proposed to lecture, hunt meteorites, and supply specimens to museums. He decided to resign his teaching position as soon as his finances allowed. The Paragould, Arkansas meteorite fell on February 17th, 1930. It was visible over thousands of miles, covering several states. Nininger rushed to the vicinity and helped estimate where it might have landed. An 800-pound meteorite was found in a hole 8 feet wide and 8 feet deep. My grandfather is on the right in this photo. After a bidding war, he was able to purchase it for $3,600. He had to borrow money to make the purchase, and the price was too high for him to keep. So he sold it to the Field Museum in Chicago. However, it gave him some much needed profit and the confidence to resign his teaching position. Later that year, they packed up their family and moved to Denver. They had a verbal agreement with Ward's Natural Science Establishment in Rochester to buy up to $4,000 in spare meteorites per year. Unfortunately, this was terminated in short order due to the Depression. He was offered the position of curator of meteorites at the Colorado Museum of Natural History for an honorarium of $50 per month. That was his only steady income. They set up the first commercial cutting laboratory for meteorites in the United States. The only other such equipment was at the United States National Museum. From 1930 until the start of World War II, he carried out his completely self-funded program of meteorite education and recovery. His experience with the Paragold meteorite had taught him to save the best specimens for his own collection and trade with the surplus. His goal was always science, not income, which was a good thing because he was always operating and living on a shoestring budget. I'll show just a few of my grandfather's most interesting finds during this period. This is one of the fragments of the Pasamonte, New Mexico meteorite, which fell on March 24th, 1933. This was a very large fireball that broke into pieces at a high altitude. The majority of the material was contained in a dust cloud that hung in the air for at least an hour and a half. The total weight of the fragments recovered was only about 8 pounds. This fragment was recovered shortly after its fall, before it had a chance to weather. This is a eucrite, a type of achondrite. It is thought to have originated on the asteroid Vesta. It shows the shiny black fusion crust that results from the frictional heating and ablation of the outer surface of the rock as it passes through the Earth's atmosphere. The most amazing thing about this fireball was that a cowboy named Charlie Brown managed to snap a photo of it. The fireball occurred at about 5 in the morning while Charlie Brown was having breakfast. He always kept a camera near his breakfast table, and when the meteorite turned the wee hours of the morning into midday, he grabbed his camera, ran out, opening it as he ran, and snapped the shutter. This was the first photo of a meteor in flight. I still haven't seen anything else that compares. This is Charlie Brown, who took the photo. In March 1935, following a lecture in a high school, a student came up and said one of the specimens resembled a stone he and his father had plowed out some years before and had thrown under a fence. They drove out to the farm, found a small corner of the fragment still protruding from the soil, and dug out a 16-pound meteorite. It was evident from looking at it that it was a piece of a larger mass. They found small fragments in the field where it had been broken up by the plow, and they started to dig. They kept digging, and they recovered this 749-pound stony meteorite. Meteorite was very weathered, and they had wrapped it in burlap and plaster to move it. The interesting thing to me about this photo is all the spectators that came out to see. In 1937, my grandfather visited a ranch near Miami, Texas, after hearing a tip about a possible meteorite. The rancher wasn't very responsive until my grandfather mentioned that he was prepared to pay $50 for the meteorite. The rancher immediately called his ranch hand and told him to show my grandfather where they had just built a fence. The fence builder had taken about 50 stones, including the meteorite, and buried them as dead men along a 2-mile fence to hold it down wherever it crossed a ditch or dry wash. My grandfather, along with my Uncle Bob, started digging up the dead men. The 26th one was a 127-pound meteorite. These examples show my grandfather's general approach in tracking down meteorites, whether they be from a fireball or a general search. He would work mainly in rural areas, ideally ones where there weren't too many other rocks. He would talk to people who worked on the land and had the most opportunity to find meteorites. That was primarily farmers and ranchers. He would also speak to students who might spend time outside and might inform their parents about meteorites. He would try to generate interest in the subject. He would make it known that meteorites were important to science and also that they had monetary value. In this way, he was very successful in recovering meteorites. In 1941, Dr. Fletcher Watson of Harvard wrote that, at present, Nininger is accounting for half of all the discoveries of meteorites in the world. Now here's another Iowa connection. The Grinnell College Physics Museum has a meteorite collection. As I mentioned, my grandfather's meteorite program was entirely self-funded, and he was always on the tightest of budgets. When it came time for his 3 children to go to college, he had to get creative. He arranged to pay for most of his children's college expenses through exchanges of meteorites with the colleges. My mother attended Grinnell, and almost all of her expenses were paid with meteorites. They are on exhibit at the Physics Museum in the Noyes Science Center at Grinnell. Tuition was also paid in that way for my Uncle Bob at Amherst and my Aunt Margaret at Carleton College. My mom and aunt were attending college during the time of World War II. My grandfather largely had to stop his program during the war. There was rationing and no resources for field work. He found employment working as a salvage investigator for the War Production Board and later worked in oil exploration. He still spent all his spare time thinking about and looking for meteorites. At the close of the war, he decided it was time for a change. Nininger had visited the Arizona meteorite crater with his family in 1925. He had done some collecting and research there in 1939. He thought the crater would provide a perfect location for more research. So he and his wife decided they would relocate near the crater. They decided they would build their own museum solely devoted to meteorites. It would be the first and only museum of its kind. They leased a building on Route 66, about 5 miles north of the crater, and moved their collection. This is a picture of the interior of the museum. And coincidentally, that's my mother in the center of the photo. She just happened to be there at the time they were doing a photo shoot. The museum was popular, but it never did too well financially, especially after Route 66 was rerouted to Interstate 40. The extra time he had due to the rerouting of the road gave him a chance to do a lot of research on the crater. That included identifying explosion products from the impact that helped prove that the meteorite that formed the crater vaporized on impact rather than lying in the bottom of the crater as many had thought. My grandparents finished out their lease in 1953 and then moved the museum to Sedona. The first years in Sedona showed promise. My Aunt Margaret and her husband Glenn Huss moved to Sedona to help with the museum. But they had to face the fact that the museum was not going to be a financial success. They had to face the reality that they were getting older. He was then in his late 60s and needed to survive financially. This is the interior of the museum in Sedona. In terms of amenities, it was an upgrade from the old museum on Route 66. By this time, the Nininger collection of meteorites was the largest private collection of meteorites in the world. They had considered selling it when things got really tough financially, but they wanted to keep the collection together, and that type of sale never worked out. Then in the late 1950s, after Sputnik, there was a lot of interest in space and a lot of interest in meteorites. The British Museum of Natural History had shown an interest in purchasing part of the collection, both for display and research. During negotiations with the British Museum, there was also a sudden interest by Arizona State University and the Smithsonian Institution. There was delay by the American institutions, and the British Museum made a firm offer. In 1958, they purchased 21% of this collection for $140,000, roughly $1.5 million in today's dollars. This was an amazing windfall for my grandparents. They were out of debt for the first time in 35 years, and they promptly left on a 6-month tour of the Far East and Australia with plans to do lots of field work and visit institutions along the way. They returned from their tour to the museum, which was still barely surviving. In 1960, Arizona State again showed an interest in buying the remainder of the collection. Finally, Arizona State was able to get funding, and they purchased the remaining majority of the collection for $275,000, roughly $2.9 million in today's dollars. And then my grandparents went on a 4-month tour of Europe. This is a photo of H.H. in 1961 in front of his newly built home in Sedona. This was the first real home that he ever owned. My grandfather was a field scientist. His strengths were observation, critical thinking, and persistence. He had many ideas that were ahead of his time, but he didn't have the resources to prove them. In May 1942, Popular Astronomy published an article by Nininger titled Cataclysm and Evolution. In it, he proposed that the Earth bears many scars of far greater dimensions than the largest known craters, and that the collisions provided an explanation for the sudden blotting out of the fauna and flora which the fossil records suggest. If he had had a better publicist, he might have used the phrase killed the dinosaurs and gotten some more attention. Since then, maybe 150 large impact craters have been discovered on Earth, and the idea that a large impact wiped out the dinosaurs is pretty much accepted. Now back to Estherville. The Estherville meteorite is a stony iron meteorite. It has a matrix of very brittle stone embedded with metallic nuggets of various sizes. Thousands of small fragments or pellets had rained down along with the larger pieces. Nininger examined 600 of these in the Yale Museum. He was told he was the first person who had ever shown any interest in them. About 30% of the pellets showed signs of orientation. They had fallen in a stabilized position with sufficient force and speed to produce frictional shaping, a melting away and molding of the forward part, while the protected rear portion remained relatively ineffective. Their noses were almost perfect hemispheres. He was convinced that the shapes of oriented meteorites that had survived passage through the Earth's atmosphere had lessons for aeronautical engineering. He was convinced that a blunt nose on high-speed missiles was the way to go. He published 3 papers on oriented meteorites and their implications in 1935 and 1936 in Popular Astronomy, the American Journal of Science, and the Scientific Monthly. On July 26, 1952, the cover of Science newsletter depicted a needle-nosed model missile streaking through the Ames Aeronautical Laboratory wind tunnel at Moffett Field, California. Nininger wrote more than once, suggesting they test a shape similar to his Estherville pellet. He got nowhere. On June 1st, 1957, the cover of Science newsletter carried a drawing of a new nose for missiles, the blunt nose. H. Julian Allen had come to the same conclusion mathematically. This is an illustration by NASA of a meteorite entering the Earth's atmosphere. There was a period in the development of spacecraft where it seemed an apparent impasse had been reached because engineers saw little, if any, hope that a craft could be designed that would not burn up during its return passage through the atmosphere, or at least develop a temperature lethal for any human occupant. The Meteorite Museum was visited by numerous representatives of the space program who were looking for information regarding some metal that could resist the heat of friction. They reasoned that if the meteorite had survived its passage through the atmosphere, it must have a special type of resistance to heat. On one occasion, 2 engineers visited and launched into a discussion of the re-entry problem, saying that they thought my grandfather, having spent many years studying meteorites, might know what substance or substances in meteorites were responsible for their great heat-resistant qualities. He explained that meteorites survive to reach the soil simply because there is sufficient material on entering from space that some is left over when deceleration is accomplished. He wasn't sure whether their faces were merely registering letdown or contempt for his ignorance. Ultimately, some of these lessons from meteorites may have had an impact. What else is there that can give one such a sense of wonder as holding in one's hand an object that has come from space? Over his career, my grandfather's self-funded program found specimens from 226 meteorite falls, including 8 witness falls, previously unknown to science. As my grandfather's career was winding down, interest in meteorites was exploding. He was able to witness this new interest and see many of his ideas investigated. There are now numerous automated camera networks around the world to help track meteors. They're called all-sky cameras because they capture the entire sky in one exposure. This one is in France. It is part of the Fireball Recovery and Interplanetary Observation Network. This one's located outside of the Paris Observatory. Although it looks quite large in this photo, it is about the size of a regular 35mm camera. Camera networks were first proposed by my grandfather as early as the 1930s, but the first one was not implemented until 1964. It was the Prairie Network operated by Harvard. One thing he would never have anticipated are the door cams, dash cams, and security cams that now routinely capture images of meteors. The American Meteor Society provides a crowdsourced method of tracking fireballs. This is a map of a fireball sighting near Chicago on February 6, 2017. It shows the locations of the observers. Witnesses to fireballs can log onto their website and enter their location, the time they saw the fireball, and the direction and elevation of the fireball. The system then computes the intersection of all the witness sightings with each other, averages the results, and produces a trajectory estimate. This particular meteorite is thought to have fallen into Lake Michigan. Doppler weather radars are operated by national weather bureaus worldwide and have assisted in the recovery of several meteorites. While most fireballs leave no record of Doppler radar, some large fireballs do. While the exact location of individual meteorites cannot be pinpointed, radar data can help map out a probable strewn field where the meteorite fragments are likely to have landed. This is a composite view of weather radar signatures of falling meteorites during the Park Forest, Illinois meteorite fall on March 26, 2003. This one wasn't too hard to locate, though. It fell in the vicinity of Park Forest, a Chicago suburb. At least 2 houses in Park Forest were struck, as was the fire station. Dozens of other meteorites were recovered in the area in the hours and days following the fall. It was the most densely populated region to be hit by a meteorite shower in modern times. More and more, observations from amateur and from professional astronomers are making it possible to predict the precise time and landing location of an asteroid or meteoroid in advance. On January 21st, 2024, a 17-inch asteroid, more appropriately called a meteoroid due to its relatively small size, slammed into Earth's atmosphere over Germany, producing a spectacular fireball. The asteroid, designated 2024 BX1, had been discovered less than 3 hours before impact. About 200 fragments were found, the largest weighing about ½ a pound. It was found near Berlin and is called the Riebeck meteorite. It is classified as an aubrite, a type of achondrite. The Antarctic Search for Meteorites program, ANSMET, is a U.S.-led field-based science project that recovers meteorite specimens from Antarctica. Since 1976, the program has recovered more than 23,000 specimens. In Antarctica, freshly fallen meteorites are protected by the cold climate. The usually dark-colored meteorites contrast sharply with the white snow and ice. Meteorites are concentrated by ice movement towards areas where rock formations block the flow of ice. In these areas, the ice can be removed by winds, exposing the meteorites. This process effectively concentrates the Antarctic meteorites. Another area where meteorites are found in large numbers is the Sahara Desert. The Sahara Desert's climate is ideal for preserving meteorites. While meteorite recovery in Antarctica is strictly controlled and largely inaccessible, meteorite hunting in the Sahara is wide open. Meteorites from the Sahara are identified as NWA for Northwest Africa, followed by a number. ASU recently published an article titled The Meteorite Effect: How ASU's bold investment in a collection of meteorites 65 years ago powers research to this day. The article recaps H.H. Nininger's pioneering study of meteorites, how he became perhaps the single most accomplished collector of meteorites ever, and how his collection would seed generations of cutting-edge space research at Arizona State University. To quote from the article, Nininger's work anticipated the space age, and it proposed to grapple with a question humanity has always asked: what else is out there? Today, there's a direct link between the myriad space exploration missions on which ASU collaborates with NASA and that initial decision by ASU to invest in a collection of meteorites 65 years ago. There are only a handful of NASA missions into deep space every decade, but because of the extensive collection of meteorites at ASU, scientists around the country can explore the solar system right here on Earth. We have pieces of thousands of different asteroids in our collection that we can study and that we can loan to other researchers to study. We will never visit that many individual asteroids or solar system bodies. The collection gives us direct access to the variety of asteroids and other rocky bodies in our solar system. I think my grandfather would be very pleased.